unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. We are back after a period of many, many months with our Grand Tamasha News Roundup. As always, I'm joined by Sadanand Dhume of American Enterprise Institute and Wall Street Journal. Welcome back, Sadanand.
Good to be back.
And Tanvi Madan of the Brookings Institution and author of the book Fateful Triangle, your go-to resource for understanding all things U.S., India, China. Tanvi, good to see you on Zoom.
It is good to be back, Milan.
So today on the show, we are going to be discussing the triple whammy of crises facing India. We'll discuss the latest on India's contested border with China, the raging COVID pandemic, which shows very little sign of slowing down. And we'll end with a discussion of the latest economic data, another round of bad news for the Indian economy. But let us start by discussing the China issue. We have seen this week tensions along the India-China border escalate after Chinese and Indian officials accused each other's soldiers of firing warning shots. This was apparently the first time guns have been used along the contested border in many decades. Some, I would say, highly respected analysts now fear that India and China may actually end up involved in some kind of hot war, shooting war. Tanvi, give us some context. What prompted this latest dust-up? And where do you think the kind of frosty relations between the two neighbors stand?
So, Milan, the right answer to kind of what prompted it is we don't know precisely. And part of that is because both sides, as they have for quite a while, are pointing to the other one as having started things. What the Indian side has said, there was an initial burst of movement where there was some activity, some kind of movement of troops, and the Indian side released a statement saying that they had that they in a particular part of the LAC, not where some of these activities before have taken place in the recent months, but they had seen Chinese troop movements on the other side, and that they took preemptive steps to tackle those. Now, those preemptive steps just happened to result in India taking the heights at many key points, and so the one question is, it's quite plausible because it is equally plausible that the Chinese troops were moving, and they might have actually, and everybody is probably really sensitive at this point on the Indian side that they don't want the Chinese to make more gains. Did they really? They might have actually taken some steps, and the Indians said, "Okay, we need to go and take the heights and ensure that they don't take them." That's entirely plausible. It's also plausible that troop movements take place, and India saw this as an opportunity to also essentially do a tit for tat, or what could potentially be leverage down the line for India in negotiations, which is you establish a presence in kind of these areas, some of which China claims as well. And so the idea would then be that in the best of both worlds, you then sit at the negotiating table and say, we'll all move back. Now, we also have some things you want us to move back from, which is the heights. The other option for India is, since the Chinese might say, this is not going to work like it has in the past. 2013 was the prime example where we know that India had taken some tit-for-tat action, and kind of that had actually paid off at the negotiating table to get the Chinese to withdraw. But even if the Chinese don't withdraw, the point is then India is in a better tactical position. Now, all this means, though, is that there's an expectation: will the Chinese actually now not retaliate in turn? And the thing is, as you keep bumping up against each other, particularly before winter sets in and movement gets a little bit more restricted. It's not impossible. The India-China war took place in October, November, but movement gets restricted. Then this is a key point, a duration of time where, yes, there is always, and I think there's been a potential for escalation even before. There's a potential for escalation now. The foreign ministers met in Moscow recently. The 5-point statement, and I don't know who came up with, let's do 5 points, because all it reminded me of is Panchil, which is remembered more in the breach than anything else. Release this thing. But I think wisely everybody is saying, look, we've seemed to have seen this dialogue and them saying the right things. Let's see where it goes. There are a couple of differences from what we've seen before. The Chinese released their own statement. It was a little less belligerent. It was a little like, broadly put, passive voice. Frontier troops must be withdrawn, not India must withdraw its troops. I think, that's something that's a positive. There's so the less belligerence and the fact that they actually released a joint statement. But I think it reminds me of what Steve Cohen used to say, which is implementation hona chahiye, or for your non-Hindi speakers, there must be implementation. And so I think that's where we stand. We stand today. Let's wait and see.
Sadanand, also this week, in a separate development, the Indian government banned a whole slew of Chinese apps, I think something like 118 in total. This comes on the heels of a previous ban of 59 Chinese apps, including TikTok, which was a big deal earlier this summer. You wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal in July that we'll link to, which said that the ban could, quote, seriously set back Beijing's ambition to replace the United States as the world's dominant technological power, end quote. Are you more or less confident in this possibility today in September 2020?
First, I have to start with a confession that I wasn't really clear what PUBG was. but apparently it's a really big deal. To get to your question, it's not as though India necessarily matters at this point in terms of a market. So, for example, the last year for which we had figures available, TikTok in India accounted for just about 1%, or actually not even just about, less than 1% of ByteDance's revenues. That's the parent company of TikTok. But India does matter in several ways. The first is that by banning these Chinese apps, India signals to other countries that this is possible, and almost immediately we saw Mike Pompeo talk about it after India's action. You see that TikTok is in trouble in the U.S. A lot of people are saying it must sell itself to U.S. investors. You had noises about this in Australia and so on. So in terms of precedent setting, that's one thing that sort of affects the Chinese. The second is that this could extend beyond apps. And if, for example, India decides, as seems likely from everything I'm reading, to keep China out of 5G, then that affects the global ambitions of a firm like Huawei. And thirdly, and this is something that I came across while researching this column, is that there's this debate going on about artificial intelligence where some people say that what is really critical is the number of users. And so if you are locked out of the ability to use, tens of millions have access to data of tens of millions of Indians, even though those Indians may be providing you very little revenue per user, they're still helping you hone your algorithms and so on. So for all these reasons, if China and Chinese apps are locked out, it makes a difference to the future of the sort of global ambitions of China as a tech power. So I don't want to exaggerate the point, but I do think that it is more significant than one would think at first blush, merely by looking at revenues.
So Tanvi, let me ask you about the role of the United States in all of this. Of course, as is his wont, President Trump volunteered to mediate between China and India. I feel like each time he does this, it gets less and less news attention, which is probably a good thing. I'm not sure that many people really took it seriously this time, but there is some chatter, particularly amongst some Indians and Indian Americans that I've spoken with, that one of the real concerns is that a Biden administration, if that were to come to pass after November, might try to establish some kind of rapprochement with China, some kind of G2 future that could ruffle feathers in New Delhi. Give us a sense of your own view as someone who has studied U.S., India, and China for the broad sweep of history. How might things change in a Biden administration? Or do you think, the change is going to be on the margins?
So I think, some of this comes from an impression that existed despite actually how much India and the U.S. did on the defense and security side in the Obama administration. There's this impression, and not just in India alone, in a number of countries in Asia, but frankly also in the US, that because President Obama wanted a climate change deal, he, essentially looked the other way or didn't press China or try to deter them. this usually comes in the context of the South China Sea, but people will point to that as an example of, could have done more then. And so there's this concern that is what a Biden administration would do, that either because they will think that the Trump administration has gone too far, or because they will want to work on these these transnational issues, challenges like pandemics and like climate change, that logic will return. The question is, what will the Chinese ask for in return? And they'll say, well, we'll only cooperate with you, even though it makes sense for us to do it from our perspective. That we will ask you to roll back certain things. So I think that is where this concern comes from. And I think you could probably add one more to that, which is this conversation that some are having on both the right and left in the U.S. about restraint, about why is that really the U.S. needs to focus at home and not make these commitments abroad. So I think that's the case of why people are concerned. I actually think, though, that there are some. I don't think this idea that we're going to go back to that 2012, 2013, 2014 period is correct. I just think there's too much water that's flown under the bridge. The Chinese don't help themselves with what they do. And you do have, interestingly, on the left, for perhaps different reasons, either because they're concerned about Chinese behavior vis-a-vis Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, or because of, say, labor groups who are concerned about it from that perspective, that you do have concerns on the left as well. And then the Democratic national security establishment, particularly the younger generation, I think is also quite tough on China. So I think the question is going to be with the Biden administration. I don't think it's the question. I think they will still see China as a challenge. You could actually see a situation where some of the differences in approach they take actually might benefit India. So one area it would benefit is the couple of places that the Biden team has said is we'll work better with allies and partners, take everybody along. Not do things like unilateral tariffs that end up hurting our allies and partners as well. But I think the other thing is, if the Biden team is serious about investing at home, that is a good thing. Research and innovation in the U.S., a rejuvenated U.S. is actually a good thing, I think, for Indian interests vis-a-vis China. So I think, but the question is, will it be tempting for a President Biden who tells himself, I can convince Xi? And will the Chinese say we have a window of opportunity to offer him something he needs? But I don't think it's a given, and I don't think we're going to go back to a more accommodative. It will still be competitive, and I think too much has happened. Since I'll just finally say one thing. One shouldn't assume that a Trump two-term, yes, I think Indian Americans like that he was tough on China. But the unilateral approach he took hurt Indian interests too. Second, the one thing we know about him is there's some things he has an instinct on. Three things: trade, immigration, and alliances. If he actually feels validated in those, and if he's reelected, that could mean adverse effects for alliances in Asia, which India will not benefit India as it tries to deter China. So I don't think. I don't think it's a given one way or the other. India will have to watch closely. But I think there are pluses and minuses to the China policy that both might take, either a Biden presidency or another Trump presidency.
So let's transition to our second topic, second happy topic, which is COVID. India earned the dubious distinction this week of surpassing Brazil for the title of the second worst COVID-affected country, accumulating more than 4 million total COVID cases since the pandemic first struck. On Thursday alone, in a 24-hour period, India registered more than 95,000 fresh COVID cases. Sadanand, let me start with you. How will history judge the Modi administration's handling of this public health pandemic?
This is going to sound like a cop-out, but I genuinely think it's far too early to say. Is this something that will be over in 3 months, or is this something that we're going to be struggling with for 3 years? Are other countries going to get on top of this permanently? So they're sort of, it's hard to say at this point. I will say that, to Modi's credit, he has, broadly, he hasn't been anti-science. He hasn't taken the sort of positions that we've seen Trump take on mask wearing, or I think Bolsonaro sets the gold standard for craziness on this particular topic. And so, compared to some of the populists with whom Modi has been compared, he's been sort of, fairly on the sane end of the spectrum. I think some of the people I've spoken with about this do feel that India moved too late. And essentially, it lost the month of February when it was busy hosting Trump, busy destabilizing the government in Madhya Pradesh. And that by the time the lockdown happened, it was already too late to actually effectively implement tracing procedures. The other criticism that I have found convincing, and I think most people would agree on this, is that the suddenness of the lockdown really turned out to be an economic disaster and caused a vast amount of misery. So, if I had to take a guess at how history is going to judge Modi on this question, I would say at this moment it does look like the major thing that we're going to remember is the migrant crisis. And unfortunately, he doesn't come out looking very good because it really has all the hallmarks of this impetuous style of governance that doesn't really believe in too much planning, believes in big impact. And if he had actually succeeded in quashing the spread of the virus, then maybe he would have been justified. But as things stand, India has got the worst of both worlds. He's ended up really gutting the economy without slowing the spread of the virus.
So it's interesting just to go back to the first thing that you said, because it somewhat contradicts the other narrative, which is in fact that Modi moved too early, that he insisted on a highly stringent lockdown when India only had, 500 cases. And as a result, given where we are now with 80, 90, 100,000 cases a day, there is simply no appetite for any kind of serious lockdown because you had that window of opportunity and you used it too early. Do you think there's anything valid there?
No, because I think that the 500 cases was because there was very little testing. And again, at least sort of the folks I've talked to, people like Jacob John on this, say that essentially it had already entered India by February. So you had the first early cases that come to, in Kerala, which were successfully isolated. And then you had this other batch with these Italian tourists in Rajasthan and so on. So by the end of March, even though officially India would have had only 500 cases or 500 odd cases, I believe that the reality, it had already spread in a way that made contact tracing extremely difficult.
So, Tanvi, you tweeted about an initiative that India has undertaken with Japan and Australia called the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative, the SCRI. I guess my question is not so much about this effort specifically, but the more general question: has COVID brought India closer together with other countries in the region, like the Quad countries, say, who are also concerned about China's rise? So in what ways do you think COVID and geopolitics have kind of come together to create a shifting mood in Delhi?
So I think, it has had an impact. And I think partly it is a combination of China's behavior vis-a-vis COVID, what COVID has made evident about supply chains, and third, Chinese behavior during that time in terms of regional assertiveness. So all three things, I think, elements have made a difference. And what they've done, I think, is whether it was the Chinese lack of transparency at the beginning, or then, using economic coercion, trying to use economic coercion to get other people to either let their people in or not institute travel bans. I think there were always these kind of abstract ideas about, what would a Chinese-dominated Asia look like? And now here you're seeing between kind of the way they reacted to COVID, what they did at the WHO in terms of trying to shape and influence their reports, but also what they were doing in terms of regional assertiveness across the board, whether it was against Australia, India, Japan, Taiwan, what they were doing in Hong Kong, and then pushing everybody, all the claimants in the South China Sea. All this is happening in this kind of first few months of 2020. And what it does, I think, is these abstract ideas about, it makes it very real. It's like, okay, this is what China is going to be like. And you could think that, this is something Andrew Small said recently, that this is a missed opportunity for China, where they could have actually, having come out of it well, actually pointed to the US and others and say, look, we're actually going to be benevolent. We're going to come out. But, I think Chinese actions have made real that, it doesn't necessarily stick to the rules. It's not transparent. When you have somebody like former Indian Foreign Secretary and Ambassador to India, I think Vijay Gokhale wrote a good piece on this in the New York Times, which is, and he linked it to COVID, that they're showing us who they are. And, the fact that he also wrote, I think in another article, that it does matter that they're not a democracy. And usually you didn't have Indian policymakers ever talk about the Chinese not being a democracy, mattering as such. So I think it has made a difference in terms of making these challenges not abstract, but real, because of Chinese behavior. I think on the supply chain side, what it's done is, and this is for all these countries, a number of countries, India is a good example, had been talking about the fact that, Indian pharma industry is way too dependent on advanced pharmaceutical ingredients from China. What does COVID make clear suddenly? It makes clear, one, that natural disruptions can occur. You just shouldn't be so dependent on one supplier. And not intentional disruptions, as in China wasn't blocking APIs, but just because of disruptions, because of COVID, you start realizing that these supply chain dependencies could be real. And it's not just India who realizes, it's everybody else. People realize how dependent they are on medical equipment and how China could use it, not export enough, etc. And I think finally, because of economic coercion, what they've done with the Australians in particular, which is, the Australians dared to just ask for an independent investigation, and then, having kind of essentially sanctioning them and making it harder for the Aussies to export barley, beef, and wine. I think were the three things to China. That this, I think, has brought together, because this is happening in a number of other places. So if you think about the supply chain resilience initiative, which is what Australia, India, and Japan are saying they're going to launch later this year and will welcome other like-minded, each of these countries in different ways, and particularly Australia and Japan, have very directly been affected by economic coercions from China. So do you really want to, this is a time, and that resilience means either onshoring or it means diversifying your suppliers. And I think what India will be hoping is, I think India wants kind of the best of both worlds, right? India wants to onshore most and diversify a little bit, but it wants everybody else to onshore less and diversify, including to India. And I think that, and you guys have spoken and written about this, is at the end of the day, whether India can successfully do that really and be that alternative or that kind of place where people who have a China plus one strategy can go, really depends on what, not just the announcements, not just saying we are ready for business, but whether, it can actually offer that business climate that these companies and countries want.
So, Sadanand, one more question on COVID. We haven't really seen major domestic pushback in a political sense when it comes to Modi's leadership on the COVID question. Just like in the United States, sometimes you just feel like there is this awful statistic operating in the background of 1,000 deaths a day, and people have just, I don't know, in a way priced it in almost. Do you think that the pandemic is becoming kind of a non-political issue in India?
I mean, the real test of that is when we're actually going to see, maybe in state elections, right? So we don't have, what's our evidence for that? I mean, we had a recent poll in India today that showed that Modi's approval rating remains sky high. In fact, has risen. So that's certainly there. I think this is something we've talked a lot about over the years. In many ways, Modi is Teflon. He is able to survive things that would really have hurt any other politician. He's, of course, helped by the fact that the opposition is particularly inept and they're in the middle of their own extended meltdown. He's also helped. Exactly.
We keep extending it. It was from 2014 to 2019
he's
to 2020.
also helped by the fact that the media in India is quite tame, and he has not been attacked for this the way I imagine he may have been if we had the sort of media we saw, say, in the last few years of UPA2, where there was a sort of ability to really go after the government on television night after night and so on. The media is much, much tamer right now. And then lastly, I think, and this is, in fairness, there's some truth to this, a lot of people sort of say that, well, why blame Modi? I mean, we all know that India doesn't have such great health infrastructure, doesn't have that many doctors per 1,000 people, and so on. And so I think, as in many things, he benefits from just coming across as well-intentioned, trying to do the right thing. And people don't really seem to judge him in terms of outcomes, which I think is, it's the greatest political gift, right? I mean, people around the world, leaders around the world must sort of be hoping and praying that if, why can't we have this? That we're sort of, people judge us because of it, because they think we want to do good things as opposed to what we actually achieve.
That would be a great, like in all of our yearly evaluations. Like, I really intended to do this book.
I meant well.
This is a natural segue to talking about the economy. India recorded a nearly 25% decline in its GDP last quarter, the worst performance of any G20 country over the past couple of months. It's possible that these numbers could be revised further downwards in the weeks and months to come. Goldman Sachs now predicts 15% economic contraction in fiscal year 2021. These are just sort of horrific, almost like mind-bending numbers. Rahul Gandhi quipped that, Modi promised to end Corona in 21 days, but he ended jobs instead. Sadanand, let me ask you first, do we see any incipient signs from Delhi in terms of kind of fashioning some kind of more robust, proactive economic
as you know, there's
response?
been a lot of criticism of their response to COVID per se, right? And they've been criticized for being somewhat miserly in their response. They have done other things, right? They've moved in terms of agricultural reform, for instance. Tanvi talked about trying to roll out the red carpet for manufacturing to diversify. So it's not as though they claim that they want to sell a whole bunch of public sector companies, including Air India. I mean, we've been hearing about this for a while. So it seems to me that their response has been, it hasn't been non-existent, but it's almost as though it has not been particularly focused on the crisis at hand. And it's been, if you want to give the most charitable possible spin, it's been on using the crisis to, in fact, push through some other reforms.
Other reforms which have sort of been pending that
Exactly.
Economists have long been pushing for. Tanvi, we've seen one major development, which is almost the breakdown in relations between the center and the states over the issue of the goods and services tax, the GST. By law, the center is committed to compensating the states for a period of 5 years to make sure that the states are kind of made whole, that they didn't lose money during this transition period to full GST implementation, and that the act would be kind of revenue neutral. Now the center is going back to say it can't pay up because of the shortfall in revenues due to a quote unquote act of God which has spawned many, many memes. Is there a chance that this major tax reform, which was seen as a kind of generational reform, could fall apart? And if so, what impact do you think that would have on sort of brand India?
So, Milan, it'd be great to hear you. I mean, you've written about the kind of federalism issues. So it'd be great to hear you. I don't want to turn it around entirely on you, but the three things I will say where I think particularly in terms of where it might have an impact, particularly if you're looking at it from the outside, which is one, what does it say about the commitment that central government's commitment? It made a commitment to these states. And that's linked to kind of the other thing, which, whenever we talk to private sector, one of the things you hear, number one, when you ask them what do they want to see in India, they say certainty, consistency. And if now it looks like, well, because they don't know if the government's commitment can be taken seriously, there might be changes, and so suddenly again, you're adding another element of uncertainty into the business climate. What does it mean? And I think finally, the thing that I think, if it doesn't, what does this do to states' appetite to go along with reform that's done on the central level? Which is, any reforms that are going to be done, you need a certain amount of state buy-in. And if they say, look, you reneged, but you guys are more of the experts, so it'd be interesting to get your sense of this.
So, I mean, the way I see it, Milan, very quickly is that there's a legal aspect and there's a moral aspect. And legalistically, the central government may in fact have a point, right? That there's this special cess and there's this fund that they have, and if there isn't money in the fund, then they don't have to pass it on to the states. But morally, they don't have a leg to stand on. And I think in politics, that matters. So I actually think they're playing with fire on this question, right? Because whatever the sort of legality of this, the fact is that the states were given to understand, and the people within those states were given to understand that they would be made whole, as you put it, over 5 years. And for the government now to turn around and get all legalistic will be seen by many people as a breach of faith, and justifiably so. And it frankly, it confounds me to see them take something this potentially serious in such a cavalier fashion.
Tanvi, I think the way I would respond to that is that, there have been a lot of concerns over the past 6 years about the concentration of power in the executive and in the PMO. And often we then jump from that to talking about the erosion of horizontal accountability institutions, whether it's the Supreme Court, whether it's the Election Commission, the Central Information Commission, the CAG, right? And we sort of all know the 5 or 6 worrying signs. But I think the other way of thinking about this is the kind of vertical accountability or relationship between the center and the states. And here is where actually this government got off on a relatively good foot by it got credit from some quarters for abolishing the Planning Commission, which had always been seen as a very kind of top-down, one-size-fits-all, where chief minister has to come with a begging bowl and so on, for accepting the Finance Commission's recommendations of devolving more untied funds to the states so that they could decide how they wanted to spend that money. What we're seeing now, I think, are signs that all is not what it's cracked up to be. So you had the 370 decision in Kashmir, right? The unilateral change of a federal relationship. That was one. I thought there was a data point in a piece that Yamini Iyer had last week, which we'll link to, which showed that despite the central government accepting the Finance Commission's recommendations about devolving more tax funds, in reality, it never got anywhere close because the center kept adding so many cesses, which are these one-offs that accrue to the center. And now with GST, I think we're seeing a kind of real vitiating of the kind of atmosphere between the center and the states. And, even the fact that we're talking about some important states contemplating that they might want to revisit the idea of being a part of the GST, I think tells you how dire the sort of straits are, right? So I think that the initial moves towards greater decentralization, devolution, cooperative federalism now are really kind of stand, quite diminished. Sadanand, on the kind of broader economic story, just to go back to that for a moment, you shared a pretty bleak column by Vivek Dehejia in Mint this past week that said, people have been arguing that India's economic story has hit a roadblock But I would argue that maybe it's completely over, and Subramaniam Swamy, the unpredictable, shall we say, BJP MP, has also castigated in pretty vivid terms the government for its economic mismanagement. Do you think that we are entering a new chapter, that we've kind of had this 30-year golden economic era that's come to an end? I noticed that each day this week you've been tweeting charts and tables from Vijay Joshi's excellent book about India's economic evolution. Do you sense that we've kind of now come to the start of some new era that is marks a real shift from the last,
well, first for the
century?
Swami part, right? I mean, of course, he has the magic wand, make him finance minister. So we sort of,
right.
Exactly.
The solution to all of India's problems.
Take his criticisms with a grain of salt. I thought Vivek's piece was actually it raised a really interesting question, right? Because for so long now, since the sort of advent of reforms, we have assumed that if the government just does a few of the right things, the underlying conditions in India are such: the distance from the frontier, the youthfulness of the population, the existence of an entrepreneurial class, the existence of an educated elite and a large number of engineers and so on, that India would be able to grow at a rapid rate, if not double digit, somewhere close to it, say 8% or so on, for the indefinite future. And that, of course, would have enormous implications for the country and the world. And my own sense is that it's too early to assume that COVID has simply knocked India off course. But I think it's a conversation worth having, right? And it's certainly worth revisiting. The one idea that's worth revisiting is, to what degree has the potentially overly optimistic view been shaped by those 8 excellent years India had, 2003 to 2011? And to what degree have many of us assumed that 2003 to 2011 period was kind of what we could aspire to and return to? And is that realistic? And from everything I'm reading, it's certainly not realistic in the short term, act of God and so on. But the big question is it going to be realistic to regain that in the long term? And I think on that question, we're going to see a lot of interesting debate in the coming years.
Yeah, I would just point out that, the economist Pranjal Bhandari, who I think is one of the best people to listen to on the state of the macroeconomy, has been sharing this graph of India's potential growth rate and how it's shifted from being steadily at 7% to then falling off to 6%. And now the medium-term projections is that it actually is plateauing at 5%, which when you think about, a 2 percentage point dip in potential growth is a pretty stunning development that has all kinds of larger societal political ramifications that go way beyond the economy. Let us end, as we always do, by first starting out. Tanvi, maybe I'll throw this question to you. What is an underreported news story coming out of India that we should be paying attention to, but maybe not be as tuned into right now?
So this time I'm actually going to, I usually don't, in fact, talk about kind of foreign policy stories, but I think something related to India, which kind of got lost, it's on the India-Japan side, which is Shinzo Abe's departure from the kind of scene and the impact that might or might not have. And the turn in India-Japan relations came prior to him. I mean, the other administrations in Japan have shared this idea, but there's no doubt that whether it was with the Manmohan Singh government or the Modi government, that he has really kind of turbocharged not just India-Japan relations, but also the Japanese role in Asia in a way that has benefited India, including their big connectivity plans, but also willingness to do things more on the security front, whether that was, the Quad doing bilateral now. India has Air Force, Army, and maritime exercises with the Japanese. So I think, what the impact of that might be, and it's related to, Japan has helped India, has been a force multiplier for India, as it doesn't have that capacity, partly for the economic reasons in certain countries. In certain countries, it's just easier for Japan to do these things. And so I think, that's going to have, it got lost in all the China things, but I think that's something, that needs to, and related to that is this point that, they had, Modi and Abe had this phone call, and India agreed to essentially like a military logistics support agreement. And I was joking on Twitter that, the US knows this. It took years to get one of these signed with India. And since the US is, and people talked about, you guys remember this, there were talks about, you cannot sign this. There will be marauding soldiers or sailors and soldiers, American, coming to the port and taking away our women. Well, now, India seems to sign one of these every 6 months. It has them with latest with Japan, but also Australia, Singapore, France, South Korea. So I think that's, it's just, I don't even know if it's covered. It's a good thing that it's not getting much attention.
Must check in on those sailors.
So, Sadanand, is there something out there that you think deserves more attention than it's getting right now?
Well, it's not as though it's getting no attention, but I think that, in this whole sort of ridiculous Sushant Singh Rajput,
I knew it was only
story.
A matter of time before we got there.
Yeah. No, but I think the part that is actually interesting there is the relationship between the BJP and the Shiv Sena and where it's headed. The Shiv Sena, first of all, it matters because this is Maharashtra, the richest, most industrialized state, and the second largest state in terms of Lok Sabha MPs. It also matters because the Shiv Sena is the BJP's oldest ally. And so the question really is there space in India for two Hindutva parties, or even in Maharashtra, or are we looking at a situation where the BJP essentially attempts to wipe out the Shiv Sena? So I think that's a really sort of interesting development with long-term implications for Indian politics, which I haven't seen that much discussion of.
Okay, now we end with who had the best week and worst week in India. Tanvi, any nominees for best week?
I was at a real loss to come up with a best week one this week. So I'm going to take, for a change, I'm going to take a pass on that one.
Well, I was at a loss too for best week, but then I figured I'd just say Mukesh Ambani because he's the one person who always seems to be the week. So when in doubt, just like when in doubt, I just toss in Rahul Gandhi for worst week. But so I've got my
so I have a suggestion, although it's cheating because it's really about an Indian American, although I think it could reverberate in India, which is this week Netflix named an Indian American, Bella Bajaria, the head of its new global television division, which gives her executive oversight over all of the shows in development at Netflix. And she is the one responsible for greenlighting Indian matchmaking. So if
God
you
help
like
us all.
Indian matchmaking and you want more of it, it is apparently on the way because an Indian American is in charge.
But I will say it is, if you were asking me about a best week that could involve Indian Americans, I do have one. I actually think Indian Americans voters are having a great month, if not, I don't think I've ever seen both the parties pay so much attention to a set of voters who aren't large in number, but have kind of, disproportionately, provided campaign finance in the past. But this time, perhaps because of both that the Republicans are actually making a play for them and Trump himself, but second, because of how few votes could make a difference in some of these swing states. That it's just Ganesh Chaturthi tweets from the Biden campaign, and Kimberly Guilfoyle coming up with a video, not to mention those strange Tommy Lennon thing that came out. But it's just I don't think we'll find out, including some data being released next week, Milan, that you could probably preview for us, but. It is quite significant to see this much attention being paid.
Okay, we end, I guess, on a sour note. Worst week, other than the future rise of Indian matchmaking. Any nominees, Tanvi?
Yes, and it is a combination of I don't know if it's the worst week or kind of Indian news channels, or if the worst week is the Indian public that gives these guys high ratings. But at a time when at a time when the trifecta of crises that you pointed out are playing out. Maybe it's a bread and circus sort of way. Maybe people need a distraction, but this is affecting real lives, and whether for political reasons, whether for ratings reasons, it's just been, kind of insane. And watching whether it is, that poor mailman who was surrounded by TV cameras. I mean, what did the mailman do to deserve paparazzi? But as I can't remember who it was who pointed out, you can blame the news channels all you want, but this is getting ratings. People want this. And so, I mean, I how do you not but say that's the worst week? I tried to mute every word that was, Rhea or Sushant Singh, and somehow it keeps slipping through the cracks in my filters. But yeah, sadly, this is affecting real lives and not just entertainment for a few people.
Sadanand, you have the last word.
So I actually had the exact, the same thought, but let me put it somewhat less delicately than Tanvi, and say that, I think that it was...
Those are the roles we play,
We count on you. Our listeners count on you to be blunt.
I think the worst week was Arnab Goswami. And I think that increasingly it is difficult for him to maintain the pretense that he represents some kind of crusading journalism, when it is clear that he in fact represents moral rot. And the number of people I've sort of, the people in India I've heard from, and the way people are sort of talking about this, I really think that there's a at least among a section of people, that there's a sort of, a tipping point, and a sense that this is truly disgusting. And the way they have hounded this young woman, Rhea Chakraborty, the complete lack of ethics, the scurrilousness, the putting rumors out on national television, everybody and his uncle having a right to comment on it and an opinion, the ambushing of postmen and all the rest of it. That there's a rot at the heart of it, and I think he has, for many people, come quite clearly to symbolize that rot.
Well, there's not much I can add to that. So let me thank you both for coming. Sadanand Dhume of the American Enterprise Institute and the Wall Street Journal, Tanvi Madan of the Brookings Institution. Guys, it's always a pleasure to have you. Let's do maybe one more of these around election time. I have a sense that we will have a lot more to discuss, particularly because it'll be an election month and not an election day. So we won't have any time constraints. Good to see you guys virtually, alas, but thanks for making time.
Good to be back.
Thanks, Milan.
Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com, India's fastest growing podcasting producing platform. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we referenced on this week's episode, visit our website, grandtamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Jonathan Kay, Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Maya Krishna Rogers is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was an HT Smartcast original.
HT Smartcast.